Good morning from Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Asia Society Policy Institute's webinar on the shift in Japan's arms export policy. I'm Emma Chanlett-Avery, and I will be moderating this panel over the next hour or so. Before I introduce our expert panel, let me just briefly introduce the topic in case you have stumbled into this webinar unaware. On April 21st, the Japanese government announced that it would ease restrictions on the export of lethal arms overseas, clearing the way for Japan to sell or transfer defense equipment to about 17 countries with whom Japan already has a defense technology transfer agreement. Under the previous policy, Japan was only able to export arms in the categories of rescue, surveillance, transit, warning, and minesweeping. This is not, however, just a simple bureaucratic adjustment. It's the latest in a series of shifts that the Japanese government has made that has moved it away from its post-World War II pacifist defense policy. It's also a signal that Japan is more forward-leaning in its security posture and eager to engage with other like-minded countries to strengthen stability in the region and beyond. So basically, this panel is going to look at how big of a deal is this for Japan, for the alliance, and for the region. Before I introduce our panelists, just a small note to our audience that if you have questions, you can drop those into the Q&A function on your Zoom screen, and we will try to get to those before the end of the session. So let's dive right in here. First, I'd like to turn to Okano-san to get a sense of just how significant this shift is for Japan. Is this just another one of the sort of series of incremental changes that Japan has pursued, or is this a much more fundamental change? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you very much for inviting me to this significant seminar. These three principles on transfer of equipment and defense equipment technology implementation guidelines, there's a long history about this instrument. We discussed for long in order to ease the export control of these equipment for a long time. And this revision of this time is, I would call it a significant step. The government of Japan has come a long way. The principle and guidelines are now more about, how should I say, exporting rather than restricting the export. It was a case that these guidelines are about how to restrict the export, but this guideline is now about how to promote export. And this is, of course, in response to the increasingly changing security environments around Japan. And this year is a national security year in Japan, I would say. And so this is a good segue into the revision of a national security strategy, national defense strategy, and defense build-up program. So I would say that this is a significant change in our policy. Thank you.
Let's turn to Chris now. And Chris, as I would say to my kids, is this a big deal or a small deal? And to what extent do you see this driven specifically by Takaichi, or is it a broader support base?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Thanks for the chance to be here with such a great group. I'll give you an unsatisfying answer. I think it is significant, but so this is, as Okano-san said, kind of the culmination of a slowly building tide in Japan toward more loose approaches to exports of defense equipment. In a sense, there were already exceptions that allowed this, like the Mogami frigate export to Australia was going to be an exception to policy. The GCAP fighter program was going to be an exception to policy, right? So there was already sort of indicators that this is where things were headed. But it's very important that it is now formal blanket policy that Japan can export all forms of defense equipment to this defined list of partners, as you said. Number one, it expands significantly Japan's foreign policy toolkit, right? Japan is now in a position to grant military assistance of various kinds to its partners in a way that was more constrained before. And you already saw the Japanese government doing this when President Marcos visited Japan last month. So expands the foreign policy toolkit. Number two, it reduces uncertainty for both Japanese industry and foreign industry about what kinds of cooperation and what kinds of exports are possible. There's now clarity on what can be exported where. And at least from a foreign partner standpoint, this is important. And just one example from my time in government and from what I've observed at the Asia Group, when we were considering different kinds of systems to co-produce in Japan, one of the key considerations for many industry players is, will there be an ability to export from Japan to third countries? In other words, manufacturing a piece of equipment in Japan, it's maybe first and foremost for Japan, then for the United States, but can you export countries? And in an environment where there was this offense defense distinction, the five categories, it just became very complicated for U.S. industry and foreign industry to make that evaluation. So I think from that standpoint, it certainly is a big step forward and an important one. I think the question, and we'll get into this, is whether Japanese industry will seize the day and will sort of undertake what's going to be necessary to become truly globally competitive players in this market. I'll stop there.
Let's get right into those challenges and whether or not industry will seize the day. Randy, you are here as our industry representative and would like to hear your thoughts about whether or not this policy shift is going to yield real commercial success for those firms that are pursuing this, and what are some of the major challenges that they face in getting to that point?
Well, thank you, Emma. Thanks for having me. So I guess the short answer is I don't know, and the other one is it's going to take time. As Chris was alluding to, I think this is we have to look at it as a Japanese government strategic tool, and it's not just about private sector's business expansion. We have to see it in a very broad strategic context, and so with that, I'm going to make a few comments. For us meaning the Japanese defense business in general, this is a major sea change. Defense export is an example where policy is changing faster than industry, which does not happen much. It has become alarmingly clear that industrial resilience constitutes an important part of deterrence. But the defense industry is used to stability and continuation. So the big question is, can the industry change? Also, Japanese defense industry has been seeing players exit over the last 20 some years. So can the current security and business environment change? Can that environment change the corporate mindset and turn the table? It's not an easy task, as defense industry is known for its high entry barrier. So should I get into each individual parts? So I think there are like three major points, I guess, for the private sector. Number one is business portfolio. What I mean by that is, unlike U.S. defense contractors, defense business revenue accounts for a very small portion of Japanese companies' overall portfolio in most cases. So these companies and their boards must weigh the pros and cons of participating in defense export business. For example, a B2C, a business to consumer, B2C company may run the risk of widespread backlash from domestic consumers. A company doing overseas business may face economic coercion from certain countries. Each company has to ask itself, is the upside large enough to justify the downside? How large is the reputational risk? Some companies remain sensitive about doing business even in Japan, so let alone overseas. That's the first point. Second point is the lack of business function. Current Japanese defense industry lacks an international business support function, spanning from marketing and sales to aftermarket services. The industry has been geared toward domestic business since its inception. So in order to compete in and support overseas business activities, Each player must restructure its organization and bring in new talent, which is not impossible, but may prove difficult in today's job market. Besides, the government procurement is a challenge in itself in each country, requiring expert domain knowledge. So it'll require long-term commitment from management. This will probably take decades, probably. And finally, we don't have the track record. What I mean by that is when marketing defense products, being combat proven is one of the most important factors. Fortunately, Japan has not seen active combat in the last 80 years, but that becomes a weakness when marketing. 160 yen to the dollar may be a tailwind, but having no track record makes a product less marketable.
Jamie, I want to get your take on this too. I mean, as Randy points out, the only customers for these Japanese defense firms has been the SDF for many decades. So, what do you see as sort of the major challenges to recognize the benefits of this policy, and whether or not that these firms, have the capability to scale up their production in ways that would benefit them?
Thanks, Emma, and thank you. I echo the other panelists. Thanks for being here with this great group. I'll answer your question, but I want to first frame briefly the opportunity. So with Carnegie Mellon, our think tank, we looked last year and did a study on what are the lessons learned coming out of Ukraine for the Indo-Pacific. And I think a key theme, which won't surprise anyone, is just a transformation in how allies and partners across Asia are thinking about warfare. And so I think there's a huge opportunity in key areas of emerging technology where Japanese industry has like a specialized, unique expertise. So examples I would give are robotics, right? Generalized robotics is becoming increasingly integrated with AI, and there's a need for that type of expertise for co-production opportunities with U.S. industry that has complementary expertise. Another interesting one is batteries. You see not at like the mass production scale, but in sort of the need for much more customized, secure batteries that go into drones. So there's a lot of areas where we can see an opportunity to scale and kind of a complementarity with other larger defense firms. And I think the question, though, as you pointed out, is like how the policy will be implemented and how industry will engage. And I'd make kind of 3 points. I think, of course, the Japanese government and Japanese industry will make their own analysis and proceed as needed. But 3 kind of questions I think to consider is, one, how production capacity, how industry will change its posture for production scale. So currently, Japanese defense industry has largely been focused on low rate production, and shifting potentially to a much larger scale production is a complete change in how you structure your factories, right, and your workforce and everything like that. So there's production capacity. There's information sharing agreements is the second thing I'd point out. Right now, I think it takes quite a long time to get the approvals for any foreign industry partner that wants to have a co-production agreement with a Japanese defense firm to even get approvals to talk about like what type of, screw should go on this missile. So getting that type of approval for information sharing to move more quickly will be critical. And the third is labor and specialized labor. And that's not unique to Japan. I mean, you have a shortage of electronics engineers with specialized capabilities in the United States. But I think like making sure that there's sufficient source of expertise in the labor force domestically or otherwise will be critical.
Okano-san, I wanted to follow up on a couple of things that have been brought up in this conversation so far that you're uniquely positioned to talk about. The first is what Jamie just mentioned about the challenge for the labor force, particularly given Japan's demographic challenges. Also, if you could talk a little bit about whether or not you think that the Mogami frigate and GCAP deals are sort of helping Japan to exercise the muscles that would allow it to do similar deals like this. And if you have thoughts about the approval process that was put in place in order to export lethal arms, do you think that that sort of nimble enough to make this work effectively? I know that's a lot of questions, but from your position in Tokyo, it would be helpful to hear.
Thank you. I think that many questions have been already clearly articulated and laid out here, and we know what are the challenges for us. But the basic challenge for Japan is first is to create a market of a certain scale because market was closed, so that there's no such thing as a scalable market. And so that, and second thing is that enhancing the production capacity of Japanese companies, we need to establish a new ecosystem that includes these two issues, a market of a certain scale and the production capacity. So by connecting the government, academia, startups, corporate venture capital, thereby promoting innovation of emerging technologies, including dual-use technologies, we should develop a robust innovation ecosystem in Japan that we didn't have so far. So scrapping at least the 5 categories will encourage the export and expand the market for Japanese industries. So this is quite encouraging step, if it is not sufficient. About labor shortage, we are struggling with a shortage of workers, particularly skilled workers, especially in shipbuilding industry. But that is the case with many other countries. And many production facilities in defense-related industries are also at full capacity. This is another problem. So labor side and also that the capacity side, there is a bottleneck issue. To expand corporate production capacity, so bold public support is needed in areas such as labor policy and human resource development, including training and investment in automation or labor-saving measures. These are the areas and where we should establish a combination of good policies to address all these issues. And also, we should think about the division of labor or division of production with partner countries is also important because one country cannot do everything. Every country is facing with fiscal deficit right now. How to squeeze the maximum capacity or squeeze to take advantage of the potential of all those countries' power. We should think about how better divide our production among partner countries. So these are the challenges that we are facing right now. In terms of the speed of procedures, I think that procedure has been clearly articulated and NSS will be fully involved in this procedure so that there will be first a training period. But after that, I think that we will be able to attain a cruise speed quite rapidly. Thank you.
Just one follow-up, Wakano-san. How seriously do you think that the current government is taking addressing Japan's demographic challenge? I mean, I saw a report recently that a beverage company was like shutting down a third of its vending machines because they didn't have the bus driver, the drivers to restock them. And, if you know Japan, like that's a red flag if they're shutting down vending machines. So just your thoughts, now that you are freed from government service, about how Japan's addressing this challenge, which will affect, of course, the production capacity.
We've been struggling with tackling this issue for a long time, like any other countries. And I think that 2/3 of the countries in the world, their total fertility rate is below 2.1. So that it is not a surprising thing that Japan is suffering from a 1.2 level of a total fertility rate. In order to redress that, this is a huge, huge challenge. And in order to take advantage of this new possibility in defense industry, maybe it's too challenging to expect a certain rise in fertility rate in the short term. So we have to resort to other measures, capital and technology. Technology, AI can play a role so that a good combination of technology and capital related measures will help address these issues to a certain extent. but this is a structurally difficult issue.
Thanks. I'm going to turn back to Randy now, just for a couple questions. One of them is, do you anticipate more partners coming about? More defense partners in other countries? Do you expect new entry into the market from the industrial side? And what are the areas where Japan has sort of a competitive advantage?
So, Emma, thank you for the question. I haven't heard much about new Japanese companies entering into the defense market. As I mentioned earlier, it is a high entry barrier market. Maybe we'll start to see some startups in the future, or starting maybe one or two starting up right now. But we do hear about U.S. startups looking for partners in other countries like Japan, like-minded countries, where they can, looking for companies that they can partner with to scale up production. Obviously, U.S. also has a production capacity problem when it comes to maybe drones or chips, things like that. So if the two countries, the companies in two countries can partner and work together, that might, solve a mutual problem. We're only starting to see some very early discussions in that. So I'm still sort of watching where this is going.
Chris, love your thoughts on this too. I mean, this sounds like a ripe area for business, potentially. So where do you see, other partners, either in the defense firm side or other countries, seeking these defense technology transfer agreements with the United States? Do you see this sort of marketplace become, expanding as a result of this policy shift?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Certainly, there's no question that it's expanding. And look, I mean, I think it's important to think about the role Japanese industry can play at sort of a spectrum, right? I mean, on the one end, there's kind of finished systems for export to other countries, whether it's the Mogami frigate or, surface-to-air missile systems that Japan is promoting in the Philippines. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, though, is components, right? Where Japanese industry is very competitive in a number of areas. And I see this probably as the place where Japanese industry's role will grow. So we're seeing, for example, like the United States and Japan are about to sort of move forward with co-production of the AMRAAM air-to-air missile. And Japan is going to manufacture some components in Japan that go into the missile that is then exported. I think that kind of model will be increasingly important and increasingly common. And I think you can see synergies with other parts of the region as well when you think about that work stream. Like, for example, Australia's guided weapons and explosive ordnance initiative, where the Australians also want to co-produce in Australia weapon systems. I can easily see either bilateral Japan-Australia or trilateral US-Japan-Australia work on commonly employed munitions for our platforms. So I think there's a lot of work in that space. I think, maybe just to sort of going back to some of the earlier elements of the conversation here, I want to pick up on one of the points that Randy made about the structure of Japanese industry, right? And how for the major quote unquote primes, defense remains a relatively small part of the business. I mean, to put some granularity on that, according to what I was able to dig up, MHI, which is probably the largest Japanese prime today, about 20%, I think, of their business is in defense and of their revenues. And that's up a lot from 10% 5 years ago, but it's still a pretty small proportion of the company. And you can sort of imagine what the implications of that are, right? So inside a company, there's competition for resources. There's competition for people, competition for hiring. interests that may pull in different directions if one part of a company has business on the Chinese mainland, for example. So for me, one of the key indicators of where this is going to go in Japan is, do we begin to see dedicated defense firms in Japan, true defense primes? I think we're a long way from that. When I talk to METI and MOD, they sort of lament the fact that that Japan has the structure it does. It's not easy to change, not easy to incentivize. But that's going to be one of the key indicators of change for me. One other point I want to make before I stop blabbing. I think there's more work for the Japanese government to do to promote this sector. I think Japan needs to get comfortable with high-level, leader-level advocacy on behalf of defense programs. I mean, the South Korean president will walk into meetings with his counterpart and advocate for sales of South Korean submarines to Canada, for example, right? Japan needs to be able to sort of advocate at that political level. I think we're seeing that under this administration. The question is whether it continues to grow. And then I think below the leader level, there's talk, for example, of Japan creating a new quasi-government organization dedicated to promoting defense exports. That kind of thing will be necessary. Putting in place an infrastructure that supports industry, so it's not just on industry to identify and pursue opportunities, if that makes sense. I'll stop.
We love your blabbing, Chris. Keep coming. Jamie, want to go to you for your take on a number of things here. Your thoughts on the prospects for U.S.-Japan industrial cooperation more so than we do now. And you've also did some work, I think, at DoD on AUKUS. And do you see, some potential for Japan to get more engaged in the AUKUS Pillar 2 framework, and the areas where you think that the Japan would be the most competitive?
Yeah, absolutely. So before we do that, I do want to pick up on one thread and thing that Chris said, 'cause I think it's important. I think there is a strategic question for the Japanese government that to answer, or that will become clear, is this policy change primarily about Japan's posture in the region? And as Randy pointed out, creating clarity in kind of allied co-production opportunities that Japanese defense industry can export, but it's really more about enhancing and deepening Japan's defense ties across the region, which is significant and would be okay if it's just that. Or is this also about a major economic push to expand defense exports and really transform the industry? So I think that is something that we still have to see and will play out. On your question, I think the U.S.-Japan co-production and industrial cooperation is one of the ripest areas for opportunity. So we'll take missiles and missile production coming out of Operation Epic Fury, right, in the war in Iran. There's been a huge shortage of missiles. The biggest limitation factor in that production is the solid rocket motors that go into the missiles. Japan produces some of those. Now, I don't think that Japanese industry is currently postured to ever be a mass producer of those missiles, but there's a real opportunity to expand production. The U.S. Department of War just signed an agreement actually to move forward on a specific initiative around solid rocket motor production. So that kind of the groundwork is already there for industry to pick up on and run with that type of collaboration. On AUKUS Pillar 2, I think it's interesting. I think we've seen more tangible opportunities for collaboration coming out of the Shangri-La dialogue than we've ever seen before, right? So I'm sure folks on this panel are aware, but for the wider group, the AUKUS ministers announced a concrete project under Pillar 2, Advanced Capabilities Collaboration, to work together on payload development for a number of different systems. And I think there is potential for Japan to have a role in that type of collaboration? Because the question historically has always been, what is the specific capability that Japan or any other country joining the AUKUS Pillar 2 collaboration would work on? And Japanese industry has expertise in sensors, specific things that would go into a payload. Electro-optical imaging would be one that I would look at. So yes, but I think the devil will be in the details of finding that specific area where Japanese industry and academia brings something unique to bear because of the structure of the AUKUS agreement.
Great. And as we're sort of expanding to look, at regional partners, Randy, I just want to follow quickly with you. Who do you think are Japan's most likely customers in the region or beyond? Who are they the most likely to compete with? And I would throw out the idea of whether or not Korea, Korea's had great success, obviously, in exporting their arms overseas. Do you see this as being an area of competition between the two countries?
So since we've never marketed before, we really don't know where the competition is going to be, but probably Korea will be one of them. And going back to your first question, I think the biggest market will be the U.S. I think, and other like-minded countries like Australia, for example. That I think that is where most Japanese companies feel comfortable about exporting. Uh, and we do have some, we already have exported. Certain Japanese industry has been exporting not lethal things, but non-lethal components and others, sensors, to U.S. So I think that is start from somewhere comfortable is probably the best way to go about.
Yeah, and of course, we're not just talking about new equipment either. It's the transfer of decommissioned or older equipment. And I imagine at least that we might find a market in places like the Philippines, Vietnam, other parts of Southeast Asia, perhaps India. So there's a whole secondary part of this conversation that we could get to as well.
Right. If I may just add one more thing. So Japanese companies already produces in Japan under a license from a U.S. company and some European companies. And they produce the same hardware equipment, but they sell it only to the SDF. So it's not like they can't make it. They can produce it, but we don't export it. So maybe start from where we have the know-how to produce the same equipment that we build under license in Japan. Maybe that is a low-hanging fruit.
Perfect. Okano-san, just to step back and broaden the aperture a little bit here, what do you think are the large-scale implications for the U.S.-Japan alliance? Not perhaps just from this policy specifically, but the other steps that Japan has taken to expand the resourcing of its own defense. Would love to have your perspective on that.
Can I refer a little bit about our relations between government and private companies? And I think Randy laid out clearly where the issues are. I think that how to motivate, how to make companies commit to this export of defense equipment is a crucial thing. I think, as I mentioned, that many industrial defense-related industry are at full capacity right now. They are struggling with the shortage of labor right now. And also that corporate governance, in terms of corporate governance, they have to achieve a higher rate of ROE, and does not necessarily coincide or be compatible with the increasing the business in terms of defense industry. And also there's a reputation cost. So there's a big room for the government role in this regard. And for example, how to support activities that involve high risks in terms of business, how to partner or find partners and match season needs between defense authorities and the industrial side, and how to facilitate our transfer of equipment from Japan to other countries. So that according to Yomiuri Shimbun today, that there's a story of a project of establishing an independent authority, government authority to take on these missions. And I don't know where the work is right now, but the government has certain role. And this is a kind of a new establishment or mechanism that we have to think about that. Um, the policy tool has been revised, and there's open wide possibility for the export of defense-related materials abroad right now. But it doesn't mean that it is guaranteed. So we should not be too much pessimistic by saying that we cannot do everything right now. It takes time, but we will be able to certainly catch up. We refer to Korea's practices. Government played a big role in terms of doing a high-level sales pitch to other countries. This is a one model, but the Korean style and Japanese style may be different. We are left behind vis-a-vis Korea right now. We have several lessons that we can learn from them, but also that we can put a premium on, for example, the preciseness of our technology or the package that produce when we do sales of defense equipment to abroad by adding an after-sale guarantee service. That kind of a whole package would be good competitive edge for Japanese side. So we have to learn from that. In overall, we believe that there will be a good impact between Japan and the United States. There has been a discussion about burden sharing, burden shifting, and Japan. This is a clear evidence or case that Japan expressed its firm commitment to do our own efforts to defend ourselves and also contribute to the stability and peace and stability of East Asia.
Chris, let's talk about what Okano-san just brought up. We have host nation support negotiations coming up this year. Do you think that Japan's change in its arms export policy or the other things that it's been doing is going to alter the dynamics of those talks? Does this fit in well with the Trump administration's strategy of sort of taking care of your own neighborhood?
The answer, I think, Emma, is that it should, but I'm not sure it will. In other words, the whole premise of the special measures agreements when they began, I guess back in the 80s, right, Okano-san, was the idea that the relationship was not fully balanced, right? That the United States was effectively defending Japan and that Japan was contributing, but only in a relatively minimal way. That is completely different now, right? You have a Japan whose defense spending is likely going north of 2% of GDP. We'll see how much. Japan that's investing in long-range strikes, cyber, space capabilities, a whole range of things that even a few years ago would have been hard for American policymakers, including me, my desk in the Pentagon, to have imagined. And now we have this defense equipment side where Japan can play a major role in co-production and so on if the right business cases can be identified. So it absolutely should impact how we approach host nation support agreements. My view is that it's time to sunset them altogether. At a minimum, I think it's time to reconceptualize what those agreements represent. And today, what Japan pays for essentially is the U.S. plumbing bill and labor, Japanese labor on U.S. bases, as well as some construction of facilities and a little bit of training. My hope is that we start to emphasize, maybe create new categories of spending that support training, that support maybe munitions co-production, right? Sort of develop a new line of effort that's in this space. But Emma, I'm not sure that's where things are going, but that's where they should go.
Great.
Sure.
That's helpful. Definitely a space to watch in the coming months. Um, Jamie, you've been a sort of very thoughtful observer of multilateral frameworks broadly in the Indo-Pacific. I wonder if you think that places like the Quad, which does have the U.S. involved in it, are ripe for expansion. Um, Other minilateral frameworks that this policy could support, or just more broadly knit together sort of the middle powers web in the coming years and months.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I was going to say, on the strategic context, I think yes and no. I think for the US-Japan bilateral alliance, you saw at the Shangri-La dialogue, Secretary Hegseth's speech, a real theme of a realpolitik posture towards the region and an emphasis on hard power over values. And I do think this shift in Japan's policy, although one piece, aligns the Japanese government at like a strategic level with that hard power of focus led kind of posture in the region. Um, on the specific minilaterals and multilaterals, I think it can put Japan, it kind of cements in a way potentially Japan's role as leading minilateral structures and being a regional leader. Even post the US withdrawing from CPTPP, some of the trade agreements, right, coming out of the Obama administration, Japan was really the first, right, to step forward and try to continue to keep that architecture going. And I think you've seen Japan and Australia in different ways continue that regional leadership. I say yes and no because, for example, the Quad, there was a Quad foreign minister meeting earlier this year, and potentially will be a Quad summit, I'm hearing, later this year. But I think it was also notable that Secretary Hegseth didn't mention the Quad in his speech at the Shangri-La dialogue. I think this administration has made it clear that alliances and relationships are come to the fore for the United States when it meets US interests and when there's an alignment, but less for the sake of the structure itself. And so I think Japan and other middle powers will have more of an anchoring role than the US has historically. And this policy shift through Japan potentially puts it in a position to continue that, to expand on that role.
Yeah, that's not the only thing Hegseth didn't mention in his speech at Shangri-La, but that's for another panel. Okano-san, you authored a piece in Foreign Affairs, I think in February, on the alliance and Japan's changing role. And I think there you said, Japan is very much of the idea that it still very needs the United States, but also needs to, you said, deepen cooperation with ASEAN, with Canada, with Europe. So I welcome your thoughts too on whether, specifically defense cooperation is a way to expand this middle power web. And I know Japan is a little bit, sort of struggling with the idea: are we a middle power? Are we the leader of the middle powers? Do we coordinate, between the middle powers and the great powers? So because this is an area that I'm focusing on particularly, I welcome your thoughts.
Thank you. A few points. One is that when it comes to ASEAN, it's very important to address ASEAN as an entity, but also as an individual combination of individual countries. And we have to talk to them. They tend to feel that they are neglected. We have to always address their concern by talking to them, engaging them together. And also, when it comes to Quad is a very important forum in order to realize FOIP2, enhanced version of free and open Indo-Pacific. And there was a foreign ministers level meeting in New Delhi that was quite successful, sending a strong message that we are steadily advancing the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. But the key of the Quad success is how to involve India. India is advocating, try to take a distance from their closer relationship with Russia in terms of military, but also they're advocating independent policy in terms of foreign policy, strategic autonomy, they say the word, use the word. And also that they advocate Make India policy in economic side. So that they are kind of an independent, taking an independent stance. How to get India in this Quad forum is a big challenge. We have to continue to talk with them so that Quad we be able to give practical results to the outside world. When we say that cooperation among mid-level countries, middle powers, but the important thing is that Japan, when it comes to Japan, Japan is surrounded by China, Russia, and North Korea, two nuclear powers, and one country that is developing nuclear power. And that means that we have to rely on United States extended deterrence, that's for sure. But since United States definition of concept of national interest has narrowed and become unitary, there are many, many issues that the United States cannot cover. So that's where that the cooperation between among middle powers come into play. So that also cooperation with Australia, EU, ASEAN countries, and particularly in this context, ROK is very important for Japan. Thank you.
Great. We have a pretty robust set of questions coming into the Q&A, so I'm going to turn to a few of those now. The first one might be best suited for Randy. This is Junpei Ishimaru from IISS. Asking, there's been some discussion about the possibility of a Japanese version of the foreign military sales system. What kind of support would the Japanese government need to provide to make a system like this effective? And would export financing be one of the key elements in this conversation, given Japan's longstanding experience and strength in providing yen loans? What kind of institutional changes would be necessary to take place?
Okay, well, that's a big question. Thank you, Junpei. One of my recommendations to promote the export business, one was setting up a common military export company, maybe government owned or government majority owned. But the other one was a Japanese version of an FMS system. And so instead of each company going it alone, I think it would be helpful if we can pool all the the talent in one bucket, and I think it makes a lot of economic sense to do that, either in an government FMS organization or a majority or a government owned entity. So but we can, since we're starting from scratch, we should spend some time thinking about what works in the US FMS system and what doesn't. Maybe we can cherry pick only the good parts, and set that up. And that also I think Junpei asked about finance as well. Together with FMS, so Japan already has OSA, right? Overseas Security Aid, and which stimulates demand through grants. So, or we can think about export credit, Exim Bank kind of arrangement. So I think there are many ways the government can help and nudge the industry in that direction. I don't have a concrete blueprint yet, but I think there are many existing tools in the government toolbox. I hope that answers at least some part of that Junpei's question.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Another question that we had come in from a person, let me get to my correct tab here, is about the production of drones in Ukraine, and if that could possibly be a source of demand for Japan, given this new policy. Jamie, you want to take that?
Sure. So drone production in Ukraine is fascinating. The cost of the cost that the Ukrainian industry has gotten drone production down to, at least small drones like Group 1 and 2, is so low. It's hard for any industry globally to compete. So I think you'd more see the kind of cross-pollination that I've seen is Ukrainian industry training and working with industry in Taiwan, as drone procurement expands in Japan and potentially parts of drones. There could be collaboration, excuse me, between industry where, let's say, Japan, like I said, produces more secure batteries from a cybersecurity perspective that go into the drones. So maybe exquisite parts, but the total production of drones, at least small ones, as I said, the cost is so low and it's become such a specialized area in Ukraine. I don't think you'd see Japan producing drones for Ukraine wholesale.
Great. That's helpful. Now we're sort of shifting gears here, but that's the nature of the questions coming in here. From Brandon Wells is asking about, and this is, I think, a premise we should test here. Given that Japanese public opinion remains broadly skeptical of remilitarization, how long can the LDP sustain defense export expansion through cabinet reinterpretation alone before it requires and survives a direct democratic mandate? Okano-san, what are your thoughts first about whether or not the Japanese public is more open to security expansion and Japan playing more of a role? And to what extent does this have to be driven by cabinet opinion reinterpretation, or are we going to get more into the area of constitutional revision?
Thank you. I think that the defense-related question is always perceived negatively by the public opinion. When, for example, Abe government introduced a new national security legislation that was badly received, but it is now well received by the Japanese public opinions. The way of asking questions also affects this figure of the public opinion polls. So that currently, maybe that the number of those people who say negatively about this change of government position is larger than those people who support this legislation policy change. It may be, I'm sure, accepted by the Japanese public opinion because this is not a policy. This is not a choice, decision of choice, but this is a choice. This is a decision of necessity. The severe security environment of Japan demands that Japanese defense industry, should find a larger market and also enhance production capacity, so that my estimation is that it's going to be widely supported by the public opinion in the future. Thank you.
Chris, do you have any reflections based on what Okano just said about your sense of where the Japanese public is moving on this, and whether or not that gives Japan sort of expanded ability or potential to be leaders in the region?
Yeah, look, I mean, from my point of view, the transformation in Japanese public opinion around defense and security is just remarkable when you compare it to when I first started working on the alliance in sort of the early 2000s, right? There's just no comparison both in the government to government discussions, the candor of discussions about threats and alliance responses to them, and then public acceptance of the things that Japan is doing by itself and the things that the US and Japan are doing together. To be honest with you, I anticipated more of a public backlash in 2022 after the national security strategy was released, that Okano-san played such an integral role in writing. The decision to acquire long-range precision strike weapons. I just thought this would be deeply controversial politically, and it wasn't. It wasn't at all. I remember the polls at the time indicating quite strong support for the defense buildup. So, yes, there is, I mean, when it comes to things like nuclear issues, that's still, of course, and understandably a sensitive topic. There's still sensitive issues around the U.S. presence, and the some of our posture initiatives and so on. But I think if you look at the arc of this over the last 20 years, there's been a real transformation. And I agree wholeheartedly with Okano-san, driven by necessity, the sort of an awareness that, unfortunately, the world has changed and Japan has to change with it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris, too. I mean, the lack of controversy over so many of these policies, Takaichi's, surprising rise and fairly sustained popularity all point to this too. And I'll just, to wrap it up, I'll just jump off a comment that Jake Schlesinger made here too about sort of, Japan using its industrial and export policy, marrying it with a diplomatic framework, and really playing a role in shaping a new regional order, particularly given the severe security environment that Japan finds itself in. So we're right at the hour here. I want to thank you, all of you panelists, for all of your really thoughtful comments. Thank our audience for tuning in with equally thoughtful questions. And I'm sure that this is a conversation that will continue in the months and years to come. Thank you all for joining us.